All right, we have Aiden here from Fortinet, and we're going to be talking about enterprise security and firewalls, why they're still important in 2023. So Aiden, for those who haven't met you, even though you've been on AWS On Air multiple times, introduce yourself and what is Fortinet?
Yeah, I'm always thankful for the opportunity to be on these segments, so thank you. I am Aiden Walden. I'm responsible for our technical engineering and alliances for cloud at Fortinet. So my team handles cloud, DevOps, and architecture for virtualization globally. So we work with our customers on specific use cases. We work on bringing integrations from cloud platforms into our product portfolio with our product teams. And so you asked about Fortinet. So Fortinet, yeah, let me not forget that because that's probably more important. Fortinet is we've been around since 2000. We're specifically focused on solving security challenges across the entire threat landscape. The core of our service capabilities and value is in our FortiOS operating system that drives next generation firewall capabilities across the entire IT security estate. And then we have a broad portfolio that covers everything from pre-production DAS scanning to threat hunting to endpoint. So we have a very, very broad portfolio. We want to push risk as far into the margin as possible for our customers.
Yeah, security is something that really is on everyone's mind, whether you're a startup, you're an enterprise. And firewalls is interesting because they've been around for a while. So why are we still talking about firewalls?
Yeah, because they're necessary. I hear, I have conversations from time to time, Julian, where someone will say, "Hey, well, we don't really need firewalls anymore," and it's like saying you don't need locks on your doors. And you still use them. But the thing about the firewall, and much like the lock, the lock is digital now, and they've advanced and they're much more effective, and you can put cameras on those locks as well, and so forth. The firewall has evolved, both how it's deployed and consumed in these virtualized environments, to the services that it provides, and it's because threats have evolved, and so the services that we provide have to continually evolve with those threats and the different use cases that they support. When you consider the fact that network and security have really converged and are really addressed as a single platform. And in years past, the firewall did only, stateful inspection. It didn't handle a lot of the complex routing functions. It didn't do a lot of other things in the network that they can do now. So a lot of times, customers are looking at a consolidated network and security approach. And so that's really what, your forward-leaning next-gen firewalls can do. For example, being able to support really advanced SD-WAN scenarios, as an example, right, is a very common use case that we see and a strength at Fortinet.
You really bring up a really good point that security is really connected with networking. And a lot of the people here who are going to watch today, they might be new to development, they might be new to cloud computing, they might be new to security. And now when you have to start thinking about all these things, there's probably people who are at a big company and they've been tasked with setting up a firewall and they're like, I've never done this before. I don't know anything about networking. So maybe you can just walk through for that type of person who maybe is here today. You can talk about FortiGate and maybe some advice for them.
Yeah, and so I think we back up, and before we talk about what we have, I think the problem statement, if you're a large enterprise or even a smaller organization, is the fact that one, you're really struggling for skill sets as you move into public cloud. Yeah, you have a lot of different skill sets that one has to have to be able to drive the service automation, the workflow automation, and then they have, like the type of person that is going to manage these services and the security is a person who knows cloud, who knows security, who knows networking. that's a lot to ask of an individual. And then having an organization that can scale to manage that on a day-to-day basis is a challenge. So just managing the infrastructure and the skill sets is a big problem for all organizations. And in one of the ways that the concept of a firewall is changing, and really it changes as the cloud platforms themselves evolve, and they're evolving very rapidly, is the way that we can allow our customers to consume this, right? So there's always this tension between being more cloud native or having more feature functionality that you'll typically get from a pure play provider, right? So there's this tension there, and which way do you go? It really depends on the level and depth of security that one has and the risk tolerance that an organization may be willing to assume versus do I have people who can manage do I have the skill sets in-house to manage the infrastructure, if it's infrastructure as a service, as an example. And so, one of the opportunities I think for partners of AWS is how can we solve that tension, right? And I think there's a lot that can be enabled on AWS as a software provider and ISV. Is we can deliver services that are very, very cloud native, but also give customers that depth of feature and functionality that they come to expect from a provider like Fortinet. And so that's really where I think the paradigm is. And so, if we start talking, Jillian, about the FortiGate and how that's evolved, we really stratify the services that we provide a customer for firewalling, right? So on the one end, you have a very capable service in the AWS Network Firewall. If you have very narrow requirements or that you have to provide for attestation of, hey, I've got firewalling in place for things like basic, maybe it's basic PCI or some sort of compliance requirement for a specific application, and you don't need things like deep packet inspection as an example. That may be a very good solution. In fact, Fortinet actually partners with AWS to provide the Suricata rules that drive the threat intelligence in the AWS network firewall. But there's a natural breakwater where maybe that's you no longer that service no longer meets your needs, right? And so you move into something that is more feature rich. Now, in the past, customers typically, if they looked at Fortinet, they were choosing the infrastructure as a service model. Now we try to make that as cloud native as possible by automating that through CloudFormation and Terraform and other services like that, Ansible, and that helps a lot. But it still requires some level of skill to manage the infrastructure and policy as code. And so what we've done is, especially in the enterprise segment, and this is specifically interesting if to financial services customers at this point, just anecdotally, being able to deliver on the capabilities that they expect from a pure play, the cloud nativeness of a first-party service on AWS, and so we've brought the FortiGate experience into what we call cloud native firewall, which is a SaaS service, and so we try to in the middle meet all of those requirements, and for the lowest amount of overhead to manage the service, deliver those really robust features, and so and that's really how the consumption of the firewall has evolved. And I think it's very important because if you look at where enterprises are moving, and I say enterprises because that's where we have a lot of interest right now, but customers across the spectrum, even in the mid-size and SMB space, are looking to purchase as a service, right? And I think that's driving what you see as the consumption trends on AWS.
You bring up some really interesting points, and before I keep going, I also want to call out that for those who are here and they're listening, if you have any questions about any of the topics, I know Aiden just threw out a lot of different terms and really about FortiGate and enterprise security, you can put your questions in the chat, and Aiden and his team will be watching and they can answer your questions as we're talking about this topic. So we bring up the point that there's a lot of different skill sets that are really required. And then when you have to think about, okay, how do I integrate this with my existing AWS environment. What advice do you have for that? How can people actually be able to use the FortiGate firewall in AWS?
Right. So for it to be useful, it has to be as low touch as possible, I think, because we have to both deliver the service, the provisioning portion of it, in a way that's very, very low effort, right? Because one of the things that'll do is that'll reduce the complexity of implementation, which also removes the opportunity for misconfiguration and risk up front. But then we want to be able to scale that scale the operational side of our business, so that we're not doing a lot of move, add, change type activity. And so really AWS has provided constructs that allow us to do that. Firstly, with the advent of things like Transit Gateway and Gateway Load Balancer. Transit Gateway allows us to provide more advanced segmentation within the overall network, and that allows us to achieve really great scale across large numbers of VPCs. When you add the Gateway Load Balancer to that mix, now if I'm a large organization, I have thousands of VPCs, I can now adopt a service or have a service provided to me that's built on that sort of technology, like FortiGate CNF, that can really be transparent to my overall network. So security is inserted without disrupting the rest of the infrastructure. So I don't have to think about renumbering or re-IPing my AWS environment, right? Which could be a challenge, or worrying about using a lot of natting scenarios, which can add a lot of complexity, right? And cause trouble for legacy applications that may be operating in your space. So, those bring a lot of simplicity to the implementation of the service. And so it's very, very low touch. The customer really doesn't have to do anything. And then we use services like Private Link and so forth to cross accounts. And then, for us at Fortinet, it was very important with these capabilities that AWS has enabled to provide the ultimate cloud native experience. So, for example, if I deliver a firewall, I don't want to deliver a firewall that has to be deployed on a per availability zone basis or a per account basis, because then you just get into, even though it's a SaaS, I have a lot of implementation sprawl, and a lot of becomes very complex. And so, we were very focused on how do I make this scale across the entire organization, so capture all of the accounts a customer may have in a single inspection cluster, scale that out horizontally using AWS's auto-scaling capabilities so the customer doesn't have to worry about the scale of the service, and then being able to cross availability zones, so I have some survivability across my regions or within a region, and so that was very important. And so that's all about making a robust SaaS service. But now, like if you look at how a customer has to manage their day-to-day workflow, right? One of the things that we see where risk is elevated is managing manual workflow processes and then having to respond to incidences in a manual, very hands-on, high-touch way. And so to reduce risk, we want to remove as much of that as possible. So there's another great feature that we use, which is leveraging the AWS metadata to drive policy. So within any flavor of our product that you wish to consume, whether it's infrastructure or SaaS, we're using the metadata to define the objects that, those ephemeral objects that are coming and going within the environment, and defining policy around metadata, which really changes to a more business intent driven policy than one that's like this workload, define this workload, tell it can go here specifically. It just, you create a policy that's more of a framework. And so nobody has to, implement any change activity to when the next workload comes online potentially, right? And you have a much more secure environment that way. So it's really quite elegant, in the overall workflow automation piece of it. So yeah, I think I lost track of the question because I was talking so much, but I hope I answered
But
that
you
one.
bring up some really interesting points, and it actually had my head spinning to so many different scenarios. So one that initially came to mind as you were just talking about the threat detection. So I hear this a lot because I feel like any business, it's challenging to really be able to, if you have too much alerting, then you're
Yes.
not paying attention and it's overwhelming.
Yeah.
And it's whereas under alerting, then you're missing out on something that could be a serious threat. So
Yeah.
what is your take on being able to find the right balance of alerting that actually is useful and proactive and not it just turning into just noise?
Yeah. So Jillian, you're talking about something that comes up daily. It's the velocity and volume problem.
Yeah.
There's so many alerts and they're coming at you so fast. As a security practitioner, it's nigh impossible to manage, right? So you have to have a tool set that can uh, consolidate and prioritize that information for you. And when you consolidate that information and you prioritize it for the security practitioner, you're really defining risk priority, right? So which is a better way to manage risk. And things like Security Hub, which we use within our product set, we leverage Security Hub feeds, CloudWatch, GuardDuty, and those things. Um, when you take those basic constructs from AWS and then you take an ISV product like what we provide to do the event correlation, to the risk prioritization based on again metadata that we know about that business. Is it an ERP? Is it a host running an ERP platform or a database that has intellectual property on it? Like we can tell those things and we can say that's more important than the test dev workload that somebody is running potentially, right? So, and then in that way, the tooling itself is prioritizing the risk for the operator, giving them a heads up view of, hey, historically here's a baseline. This is outside of baseline. This is a risk. This is potentially is the threat laterally to infect other hosts and services within your cloud environment. And then, but you're right. The point is, the security operator can't keep up. The tooling has to be to augment that security practice to allow it to scale. Right. Everything's about doing things at scale in cloud. And for security, it's very much the same outcome that the business is looking for in general. Right. It's being agile. Right. You want to deliver agile in cloud. For security, it's time to respond and remediate, and that's all about agility. So net, we want to create a cloud security practice that is very, very agile.
I love how you just said that. And I think that's really one of the reasons why everyone's here today is because they want to be able to learn different skills that can help them be more agile in the cloud, be more agile with their security, their DevOps, their networking, all those are combined. And I want to go back to what you were saying earlier about the complexity of what happens, and everyone here is going to experience this at some point where you're working at a business and you've got multiple accounts with multiple VPCs and the networking starts to just become like a big spider web. How do you control the security of that? So when you were talking about the firewall, the FortiGate firewall, is that at the organization and that covers everything?
Yeah, you can deploy it, right. It's about where and how you need to implement security and then how you want to segment. So then you start getting into some of the best practices that in AWS, both AWS and Fortinet have some well documented best practices online that can be found. Maybe we can post a link to that stuff. But when you get into a large sprawling deployment, the type of segmentation for east-west communication between these different services and workloads becomes very important, right? You want to, limit the access to least access. You want to consider things. It's very popular to talk about ZTNA now. That's a very important construct to a lot of our customers. AWS is doing some things there as well. So, limiting the, or segmenting your environments, both from user access and from an east-west perspective between different services becomes very important. And being able to inventory all of that as well. So the inventory piece is almost just as important. Knowing what you're running and also knowing what should not be running in your environment. And we can get into a long list of what are best practices, but
that's like an hour conversation.
Yeah, it is an hour conversation. I think the firewalling gives you an opportunity to understand the traffic flows that are traversing across whatever enclave you happen to be running in cloud, and apply the right types of security for that application. Not every application is going to need really stringent, complex security. Some of them might, and some of them might not, right? So it's a balancing act between, needs and the needs of the application, the requirements from a compliance and risk tolerance perspective, and then applying those in the right places. But basic strategies around segmenting the environment, and creating policy automation, I think, are two big concepts with the cloud firewall.
You bring up some really interesting points, and I think a lot of the people here who are listening, you're really getting them to start thinking more about their overall security, especially at scale. How can they be more agile? So Aidan, where can people go if they want to learn more about Fortinet, and be able to maybe talk to someone on your team for more information?
Yeah, so we have a dedicated group that at AWS at Fortinet.com. That email address is AWS at Fortinet.com. They can reach out directly. We work very closely with our AWS counterparts, so please also feel free to reach out to your AWS account team, or you can check us out on Marketplace to trial some of these services and get a feel for what's Fortinet on AWS, or what we can do together. If you go to the AWS Marketplace, we've talked about FortiGate CNF, just search for that. And I would say that those are good places to start.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Aidan. This has been really fantastic. And for everyone else here, stick around. We've got more coming up on AWS On Air.
Thank you.